Imagine a police officer who lost everything: his wife, his home, even his sense of hope. Yet all he had left were his two little girls and a loyal German shepherd. Just when it seemed the world had turned its back on them, a letter from a man long thought dead opened the door to a secret that would change their lives forever. What would you do if an abandoned house in the woods suddenly became the key to your family's future? Before we dive in, tell me, where are you watching from today? Drop it in the comments below, and may your day be filled with warmth, kindness, and a little bit of light. The town of Ashwood, Oregon, rested in the arms of winter, where the air tasted sharp as glass and the sky carried a pewter weight. Snow had fallen all night, soft and relentless, blanketing the rooftops, the crooked fence posts, and the long stretch of road that wound into the hills. On mornings like this, when smoke rose in threads from chimneys and breath turned white before dissolving, silence felt heavier than sound. The churchyard stood at the edge of town, a small brick structure surrounded by a scatter of ancient fir trees whose branches bent beneath the snow. The funeral procession had gathered under the pale mid-morning sky, each figure bundled against the cold, each face pinched with grief or discomfort. Sergeant Ethan Rowan stood at the center, a figure carved in stillness. Ethan was 39 years old, tall and broad-shouldered, with the kind of build that spoke of years of running toward trouble rather than away from it. His hair, dark chestnut streaked faintly with gray at the temples, was cut short in the no-nonsense style of a police officer who needed to see clearly in every situation. His hazel eyes, deep-set and shadowed, had once been warm when he laughed with his wife in the kitchen or read bedtime stories to his daughters, but that warmth had been buried under layers of loss and fatigue. His navy wool dress coat hung heavily on his frame, silver badge glinting against the fabric. His jawline remained strong, but it was clenched so tightly that the muscles along his neck stood rigid, as if holding himself upright required all his will. Ethan was known in Ashwood as a reliable officer, calm under pressure, measured in his words, and fiercely protective of those weaker than himself. But since the accident that had taken his wife, he had spoken little beyond the necessities of his work. Beside him stood his twin daughters, Clara and Rose, 6 years old, dressed in navy pea coats and woolen mittens that seemed too large for their tiny fingers. Clara, on Ethan's right, was slightly taller and carried herself with a maturity beyond her years. Her hair was long, chestnut brown, like her father's, and tangled despite Ethan's clumsy attempts to braid it that morning. Her storm-gray eyes were wide but unfocused, fixed somewhere far beyond the gravestones, as though she were still waiting for her mother to step out of the church and take her hand. Rose, on Ethan's left, was smaller, softer in build, her pale cheeks blotched red from the cold. She kept her gaze down, tracing hesitant circles into the frost with the toe of her boot, retreating into herself rather than face the finality in front of her. Where Clara had begun scribbling in a small notebook she carried everywhere, letters to her mother, she had once whispered. Rose had fallen into silence, choosing only to speak to the family's dog when she thought no one else was listening. Behind them sat Rook, the family's German shepherd, a loyal companion who seemed carved out of the same quiet grief as his master. Rook was 6 years old, large and broad-chested, with thick black and silver fur matted from the snow. A faint scar marked his left ear, earned from a scuffle in Ethan's earlier years on the force. His amber eyes remained alert, constantly scanning the churchyard, yet his posture was subdued, tail resting flat, ears tilting only when the girls shifted. Rook had once been the kind of dog who barked at strangers and bounded with uncontainable energy. But since the accident, he had fallen into an uncanny stillness, mirroring the sorrow of the household. It was as if he, too, understood that Illa Rowan, the wife and mother who had been the heart of their family, would not be coming home. The casket sat at the front of the churchyard, a polished mahogany that gleamed dully under drifting snowflakes. The pastor spoke, voice strained against the cold, offering words about faith and comfort, but Ethan's throat tightened whenever he tried to echo them. He wanted to speak of Isla, of how she loved sunflowers and painted the kitchen walls yellow so that even cloudy mornings felt bright, of how she danced barefoot while stirring pasta sauce, or the way she pressed her forehead against his when he returned from long shifts and whispered, "You're safe now." But no words came. His chest constricted, and the only sound was the rasp of breath clouding in the winter air. The mourners shifted quietly around him. Colleagues from the Ashwood Police Department stood in uniform at the back, stiff and uncomfortable, unused to seeing their unflappable sergeant so hollow. A few neighbors approached, women with fur-lined hoods and men with wool caps, whispering condolences that brushed past Ethan like distant echoes. He nodded politely, squeezed their hands, but none of it entered him. From across the yard stood Illa's parents. Doreen Whitmore, once a striking woman with blonde hair that now shimmered with silver, clutched a handkerchief between trembling fingers. Her blue eyes, rimmed red, darted off into her granddaughters with a mix of sorrow and aching tenderness. She had cried herself empty at the hospital, and now she seemed a husk, brittle but still reaching. Beside her was Thomas Whitmore, tall, barrel-chested, his face carved from granite, his mouth set in a hard line. His dark wool coat hung from his broad shoulders, his gloved hand gripping his wife's elbow firmly, as though to steady her, or perhaps to restrain himself. He did not look at Ethan, not once, not during the funeral, not during the pastor's final prayer. To Thomas, Ethan had always been an inadequate, not wealthy enough, not refined enough, not stable enough to be husband to his daughter. He had once told Illa, within Ethan's hearing, that a man trained for danger would never be trained for love. Those words now echoed in Ethan's head as he stood in the biting wind, his daughter's small hands curled into his own. When the service ended, the crowd dispersed and murmured goodbyes, footsteps crunching across snow. Doreen approached the twins, her voice trembling as she whispered their names, but Thomas held back, his jaw tight. Ethan guided Clara and Rose toward the SUV, parked on the edge of the lot. The vehicle, once a symbol of his duty, now seemed shrunken, a cold shell too small to contain the depth of their loss. He buckled the girls in carefully, tucking scarves under their chins, as if small rituals could still protect them from a world that had proven cruel. Rook leapt into the back seat and positioned himself between the girls, his heavy frame curling protectively as Rose leaned into his side, burying her face into his fur. Clara pulled the small notebook from her coat pocket, scribbling quietly, her mitten clumsy around the pen. She had once explained to Ethan that the notebook was for letters to her mother, in case she was watching. Ethan adjusted the rearview mirror, eyes tracing the pale faces of his daughters, their childhoods already weighted with grief too large for their small bodies. As he gripped the steering wheel, Clara whispered something too soft to catch, and Rose finally lifted her gaze, her lips parting just enough to ask, "Will Mommy find us again?" Her voice was fragile, almost carried away by the hum of the heater. Ethan's chest constricted, and he turned, his hand brushing her cheek with the gentleness of a man terrified of breaking something already cracked. "No, sweetheart," he whispered, his voice gravel. "We'll carry her with us instead." The words lingered, heavy and inadequate, but Rose leaned back into Rook, her small hand clutching his fur. Clara pressed harder into her notebook, scribbling in quick strokes. Ethan turned the key, the engine humming reluctantly before settling into a low rumble. Snowflakes swirled in the glow of the headlights as the SUV rolled away from the churchyard. He did not look back at the grave. He could not. Not yet. Maybe not ever. The silence inside the vehicle pressed like another weight, interrupted only by the low, mournful whine of Rook, who shifted closer to the twins as if promising that no matter how dark the road ahead, they would not face it alone. The road from the cemetery stretched long and narrow through Ashwood Valley, bordered by skeletal pines dusted white, their limbs bent like tired arms. The SUV's tires crunched along the icy asphalt, headlights casting cones of pale gold through the falling snow. Inside the vehicle, the silence felt unbearable. Clara clutched her notebook, scribbling without pause, while Rose leaned against Rook, eyes closed but not asleep. Ethan gripped the wheel tightly, jaw clenched, mind already circling around the one path left open to him, Isla's parents' house. The Whitmore residence sat on the ridge above Ashwood, overlooking the town like a stern overseer. Built from pale stone and glass, it reflected the wealth Thomas Whitmore had accumulated through decades of owning timber mills and land contracts. The driveway stretched long and straight, lined with dormant maples, whose branches cast skeletal shadows across the snow. Warm yellow light glowed through the wide bay windows, promising comfort that Ethan knew he might not receive. He parked at the edge of the circular drive, the SUV looking small and worn against the grandeur of the estate. "Girls," he murmured softly, turning to Clara and Rose, "we're going to see Grandma and Grandpa. Stay close to me." Clara nodded, clutching her notebook tighter, while Rose reached for Rook's ear and twisted a tuft of fur between her fingers like a talisman. Ethan stepped out first, his boots crunching, then helped the twins down. Rook followed, landing heavily in the snow and shaking himself, sending crystals scattering. Doreen Whitmore was the first to open the door. She was a tall woman, perhaps in her late 60s, though sorrow had aged her faster. Her once golden hair was streaked liberally with silver, tied into a low bun. Her features were sharp but softened by her watery blue eyes that now brimmed with tears as they fell on Clara and Rose. She wore a long wool skirt and a cashmere cardigan, and she trembled slightly as she stepped onto the porch. Doreen had always been the gentler half of the Whitmore marriage, nurturing in manner but bound by her husband's uncompromising pride. Isla's death had hollowed her, leaving her movements fragile, like a glass figurine that might shatter with a touch. "Oh, my darlings," she whispered, voice trembling as she knelt in the snow, arms outstretched. Clara and Rose hesitated only a second before running into her embrace. Doreen clutched them tightly, tears streaking her cheeks, whispering their names as though repeating them might anchor the moment into permanence. Ethan stood on the steps, hat in his hands, watching silently. Behind Doreen emerged Thomas Whitmore. He was tall, heavy-set, but not soft, with a square jaw and a full head of white hair neatly combed back. His face was weathered, deep lines carved by years of command and judgment. He wore a tailored black coat, scarf knotted perfectly at his throat, and carried himself with the posture of a man who had never bent under another's will. Thomas was not cruel by nature, but rigid, forged by a childhood of scarcity during the Depression that taught him only the strong survived. In his mind, emotions were weaknesses, and men like Ethan, men marked by trauma and instability, were unfit to lead. His gray eyes, cold as the snow underfoot, flicked briefly to his son-in-law before narrowing. "What do you want, Ethan?" Thomas's voice was clipped, already shaped for confrontation. Ethan inhaled deeply, trying to steady the growl that rose in his throat. "Help," he said simply. "They need warmth, food, stability. I thought maybe—" He glanced at Doreen, who was still bent over the twins, stroking their hair, kissing their cold cheeks. "Maybe you'd want to know them." Thomas's lips curled, not in kindness, but in something close to disdain. He glanced over Ethan's shoulder at the SUV, its rusted edges and dim headlights. His gaze then flicked to Ethan's unshaven jaw, the dark circles under his eyes, the police coat stretched too thin. "You brought them here because you've got nowhere else to go," Thomas said flatly. "Not because it's what's best for them." Doreen looked up quickly. "Thomas, please." But Thomas silenced her with a glance. Ethan's fist tightened at his sides. He wanted to argue, to shout, but the sight of Clara and Rose pressed against their grandmother, finding fleeting comfort in her embrace, stilled him. "I'm not asking for me," he said quietly. "I'm asking for them." Thomas's expression didn't soften. "You're unstable. You're homeless. You've seen things that broke stronger men than you. That's not what children need." He paused, eyes narrowing further. "Sign over guardianship. We'll raise them. They'll have everything Hila would have wanted, everything you cannot provide." Ethan's chest burned, but before he could speak, Clara's small hand slid into his. She had left her grandmother's arms and now stood at his side, chin lifted in defiance. Her storm-gray eyes met his, and then flicked to Thomas with a wary sharpness far too old for her 6 years. Rose, though quieter, had taken hold of Rook's collar, half hiding behind the dog's bulk, her own gaze fixed on the snow. The silence stretched until Doreen broke it. "Come inside," she said softly, voice pleading. "At least for tonight. Please." Ethan exhaled slowly, shoulders tight. He didn't want to step inside that house, didn't want to subject himself to Thomas's glares and judgments. But the twins were shivering, and Rook's breath steamed heavily in the cold. He nodded once. One night. Inside, the house smelled of wood polish and cinnamon. The fireplace blazed warmly in the sitting room, its mantel lined with photographs of Hila as a child. Birthday parties, Christmas mornings, her college graduation. Ethan's chest twisted at the sight. Doreen ushered the girls to the rug in front of the fire, where she gave them mugs of hot cocoa topped with marshmallows. Clara's fingers trembled as she gripped the cup, while Rose leaned against Rook, who had settled loyally at her side. Ethan sat stiffly on the edge of the sofa, coat still buttoned, hat still in his lap. Thomas remained standing, looming behind his armchair, as if the room itself bent around his authority. He spoke only once, his voice cutting through the hum of the fire. "One night, then we discuss what comes next." Doreen glanced at Ethan, her eyes begging him to ignore her husband's tone. "Rest, Ethan," she said gently. "You all look exhausted." Later that evening, Clara wandered upstairs with her notebook. In the dim glow of a hallway lamp, she whispered to Rose, "Grandma says Daddy's dangerous." Rose pressed her lips together, hugging Rook's thick neck tightly. The words hung in the air like frost, invisible but cold, seeding a crack in their innocence. That night, Ethan lay awake in the guest room, staring at the ceiling while the girls slept curled around Rook on a quilt. Doreen had left a blanket for him without words, slipping out before he could thank her. From downstairs came the creak of floorboards and the faint hum of Thomas's voice on the phone, low and sharp, as if already plotting tomorrow. Ethan closed his eyes, fury simmering but contained. He whispered into the darkness, "I'll find another way." The next morning arrived gray and brittle, the kind of cold that pressed into bones and made every breath sting. Snow still clung to the ground in uneven patches as the sun struggled through thin clouds. Ethan had not slept, his mind pacing in the dark as fiercely as his body once had on midnight patrol. When he heard Thomas moving downstairs, the low murmur of a man preparing coffee and paperwork in equal measure, Ethan knew what was coming, a demand, the quiet erasure of his role as father. He rose before the girls awoke, pulled on his navy coat, and gathered their few belongings. Doreen met him in the hallway, her robe pulled tight around her thin frame, her eyes swollen from another night of crying. She whispered, "Please, don't leave angry. They need stability, Ethan." He looked at her, his jaw tight, and replied only, "They need me." By the time Thomas appeared, Ethan had already led Clara, Rose, and Rook out the front door. They climbed into the SUV, the girls still drowsy, their hair tangled, their cheeks pink from the cold air. Doreen stood in the doorway, clutching the banister, her lips parted as if to call them back. But she didn't. Thomas loomed behind her, arms crossed, saying nothing but radiating silent victory. Ethan turned the key, the engine shuddered, and he drove away without a backward glance. The SUV became their home. Its back seat turned into a nest of mismatched blankets and secondhand sleeping bags, their pillows stacked against the windows to block the glare of streetlights. Rook curled up at the girls' feet each night, his heavy body radiating warmth like a living barrier against the cold. Ethan folded the front seats down when possible, though more often he stayed upright in the driver's seat, coat still buttoned, staring through the frost-flecked windshield at whatever parking lot or alley they had chosen for the night. Clara adapted quickly, in the way of children who sense the fragility of their parents' resolve. She organized their small belongings into neat piles, tucked her notebook beneath the seat cushion as if it were a secret shrine, and helped Rose zip her coat when her sister's fingers were too stiff from the cold. Rose withdrew further into herself, rarely speaking aloud, humming softly into Rook's fur, her brown eyes shadowed with confusion she was too young to name. Sometimes she refused to eat until Ethan coaxed her. Other times she would sketch crude shapes with her mitten in the frost of the car windows. Ethan kept himself alive on odd jobs. He unloaded boxes at a warehouse one day, hauled refuse from a construction site the next, and once even spent 12 hours standing guard outside a half-abandoned mill when an old army buddy called in a favor. The pay was inconsistent, often handed in crumpled bills, but it bought granola bars, juice boxes, and occasionally something warm from a corner diner. He rationed carefully, giving the girls the first and largest share, eating only when Rook nudged his hand insistently, as if to remind him he was still human. One evening, after a long day at the docks where his hands had blistered from carrying frozen crates, Ethan brought the girls to the town library. The Ashwood Public Library was a squat brick building with wide windows, the interior lit warmly by old brass lamps. Inside, it smelled of paper, dust and the faint sweetness of wood polish. For Ethan, it was sanctuary, warm, quiet, and free. Clara and Rose settled into a corner table with crayons and donated coloring books, while Rook, though technically not allowed, was tolerated by the librarian who had once been a nurse and knew the look of children in need. That librarian, Mrs. Halloway, was in her early 60s, small and plump, with a halo of gray curls and round glasses perched low on her nose. She wore cardigans in soft pastels, each with a small brooch pinned at the chest, and carried herself with the bustling kindness of a woman who had raised 5 children on her own after her husband's early death in a logging accident. Life had made her practical, and hardship had carved empathy into her bones. When she saw Ethan sitting stiffly at the edge of the children's section, his eyes scanning the room with the alertness of a man always on duty, she approached him quietly. "Your girls are lovely," she said softly, her smile warm but cautious. "They remind me of my youngest when she was that age." Ethan inclined his head, offering only a brief thank you. He did not want pity nor questions. Still, Mrs. Halloway brought the twins extra coloring supplies, slid them picture books, and even once slipped Ethan a stack of parenting guides on trauma and grief. He never asked, but she never stopped. At night, when the library closed and they returned to the SUV, Clara often wrote in her notebook under the dim glow of the dome light. Her entries were simple but piercing. "Dear Mommy, Daddy works so hard. Rose doesn't talk, but I think she hears me. Rook keeps us warm." Ethan pretended not to notice, though the sight of her small hand clutching a pen while shivering under a blanket tore at him more than any wound he had ever received in uniform. The nights grew harsher. One evening, the temperature dropped so low that the SUV's engine failed to start. Ethan wrapped the twins in every blanket they owned and pulled Rook close until the dog's thick fur trapped heat between them. He stayed awake, body aching from the cold, his eyes darting toward every shadow in the empty grocery lot where they had parked. At 2 a.m, a knock startled him. His hand went immediately to the old service pistol holstered beneath his coat, but he lowered it when he saw a flashlight beam sweep across the window. "Evening," came a voice, weary but firm. It belonged to Officer Daniel Briggs, a patrolman in his mid-40s. Daniel was tall but lean, his face gaunt from years of overnight shifts, his hair cropped short but showing streaks of gray. His eyes were pale blue, tired yet alert, the eyes of a man who had seen enough of Ashwood's underbelly to grow cynical. He tapped the window again. "Got a call about kids in a car." Ethan rolled the window down an inch. "They're my daughters," he said, voice steady. Daniel's beam flicked over the blankets, the sleeping girls, the dog curled protectively around them. He sighed, rubbing his gloved hand over his face. "You homeless?" Ethan's jaw tightened. "Not permanently." Daniel studied him a long moment. "There's a shelter downtown, families only. You'd be warmer." Ethan shook his head. "We're safer here." Something softened in Daniel's expression, though his tone stayed neutral. "You got ID?" Ethan produced his VA card. Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Army, huh?" Ethan corrected quietly. "Police now." Daniel nodded, handed back the card, then glanced once more at the girls. "You got a plan?" Ethan hesitated, then lied. "Yes." Daniel didn't press. "All right. Don't stay in one place too long. People worry." He stepped back into the night, his cruiser pulling away slowly. As the taillights faded, Ethan leaned back, chest heaving. He reached back to tuck the blankets more securely around Clara and Rose. Clara stirred, blinking awake. "Who was that?" she whispered. "Just a cop," Ethan said gently. "Making sure we're safe." Clara's eyes searched his face, but she didn't ask more. She simply pulled her notebook closer, scribbled a few lines in the dim glow, then tucked it beneath her pillow of bundled sweaters. When silence returned, Ethan leaned his head against the frosted window, Rook's paw resting across his lap. The night felt endless, but somehow, with his daughters breathing softly in the back and Rook's steady warmth anchoring him, he found the strength to endure one more hour, one more night, one more fragile step forward. The courthouse in Ashwood stood at the end of Main Street, a broad stone building with a clock tower that chimed every hour with somber insistence. On that winter morning, the sky hung low and gray, threatening snow again, and the air smelled of iron and damp pine. Ethan parked the SUV on the far side of the square, his palms damp against the steering wheel, his heart pounding in a way that reminded him of raids gone wrong during his early years on the force. But this was no patrol, no operation. This was a battle for the right to keep his daughters. Clara sat upright in the back seat, notebook clutched like a shield, her storm gray eyes darting between the courthouse steps and her father. Rose sat pressed against Rook, her small body half hidden by his black and silver fur, her gaze distant but fearful. Rook's amber eyes remained fixed on the courthouse doors, his posture tense, tail motionless as if he too understood the stakes. Ethan adjusted his collar, took a deep breath, and guided the girls out. Their boots crunched on the salted walkway, the cold air immediately reddening their cheeks. Inside, the courthouse smelled of old wood and polish. The ceiling arched high, with brass chandeliers casting muted light on marble floors. People moved briskly through the corridors, papers in hand, coats draped over arms. Ethan carried himself straight, though his uniform coat felt heavier than usual. He was not in dress blues, but in the dark navy winter coat that marked him as a working cop, a silent reminder of who he still was. At the double doors leading to family court, Doreen Whitmore was already waiting. She looked drawn, her cardigan neat, but her eyes weary. A woman torn between grief for her daughter and worry for her grandchildren. She smiled softly at the twins, bending to embrace them, before Thomas appeared at her side, his presence filling the hall like a storm cloud. Thomas wore a black wool suit, his tie perfectly knotted, his hair slicked back with precision. His lips pressed thin as he regarded Ethan. "You should do the right thing," he said, voice low. "Spare them the instability." Ethan met his gaze evenly, saying nothing, though Clara tugged his sleeve, sensing the tension. The courtroom was simple but imposing, dark oak benches, flags at the front, and a judge's desk elevated above the rest. Judge Margaret Keene presided, a woman in her early 60s with short silver hair, wire-framed glasses, and sharp eyes that scanned the room with both patience and authority. She was known in Ashwood as fair but unyielding, her reputation forged from years of dealing with families torn apart by addiction, violence, and poverty. She wore her black robe with a quiet dignity, her expression unreadable as Ethan and his daughters settled at the respondents' table. Across from them sat Thomas and Doreen, flanked by a lawyer in a charcoal suit. The lawyer, Gregory Vaughn, was in his late 40s, lean and meticulous, his sandy hair thinning but combed carefully, his sharp features angled into practiced confidence. Gregory had built a career representing wealthy families in estate and custody battles, his reputation for ruthless efficiency earning him both admiration and dislike. He shuffled through his briefcase, arranging papers with the calm of a man who assumed he had already won. "Court is now in session," Judge Keene announced. The proceedings began. Gregory rose first, his voice smooth and measured as he painted Ethan as unfit. A man with no permanent home, barely employed, suffering from trauma, and endangering 2 minor children. "Your Honor," he concluded, "these girls deserve stability, education, and a household free of uncertainty. Their grandparents can provide that. Sergeant Rowan, for all his service, cannot." Ethan's throat tightened, but he waited. His daughters sat quietly beside him, Clara holding Rose's hand so tightly their knuckles whitened. Rook, though not allowed officially, lay under the table with his head resting on Rose's lap, his presence both grounding and protective. When Judge Keene turned to Ethan, he rose slowly. His voice was rough, but steady. "Your Honor, I don't have a house. I don't have a job that looks impressive on paper. But I have my daughters. I wake every morning for them. I work every hour I can to feed them, to keep them safe. I would rather freeze in the snow than let them believe I walked away." His words were raw, unpolished, but the truth in them filled the room with weight. The judge studied him silently, then turned to the girls. "Would either child like to speak?" Clara hesitated, her small body trembling as she rose from the bench. Ethan instinctively reached for her arm, but she shook her head, eyes fixed on the judge. She stepped forward, her voice quivering but clear. "We don't have a house, but we have Dad, and that's home. He makes us laugh. He makes sure we eat before he does. He reads to us when we can't sleep. He talks to Mommy's picture every morning. Please don't take us away." Her last word cracked, a sound that silenced even Gregory Vaughn as he closed his folder quietly. The courtroom remained hushed, the only sound the soft sniffle of Doreen as tears slipped down her cheeks. Thomas shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. Judge Keene removed her glasses, folded her hands, and spoke at last. "This court acknowledges the difficulties Sergeant Rowan faces. However, the strength of his bond with his daughters and their testimony today carries weight. Custody will remain with their father under supervision, with the condition that he demonstrates progress towards stable housing. This is not a punishment, but an opportunity." Ethan sank back into his chair, relief flooding his chest. Clara slipped her hand into his, rose into the other, and for the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to exhale fully. Rook nudged his leg, with his nose, amber eyes steady, as if to say the fight was not over, but for today, they had won. The courthouse steps were still wet from melted snow when Ethan guided Clara and Rose down toward the square. The crowd had dispersed, leaving only the echo of voices and the scrape of boots against stone. The twins held his hands tightly, their gloves damp, their small bodies leaning into him, as if afraid he might disappear. Rook trotted close, his tail low, ears pricked at every sound, a silent shadow against Ethan's side. Relief had filled the courtroom, but outside, the world remained unchanged. The cold still bit, their SUV still served as home, and tomorrow still loomed uncertain. He was unlocking the door of the old vehicle when a man stepped out of a black sedan, parked 2 spaces over. The car itself gleamed with careful polish, its windows tinted, its tires still wet from the road. The man closed the door with practiced precision and adjusted his dark overcoat. He was in his early 50s, tall and lean, with neatly combed silver-streaked hair and a narrow face framed by wire-rimmed glasses. His eyes were a sharp blue, steady and deliberate, scanning Ethan as though weighing him against a file. "Sergeant Rowan?" the man asked, his voice low, professional, carrying a clipped cadence that suggested years of courtroom speeches. Ethan instinctively pulled Clara closer, his hand resting protectively on her shoulder. "Depends who's asking." The man extended a gloved hand, though he did not expect it to be taken. "Mason Carter Brooks. I'm an attorney. I represent the estate of Joseph Rowan." The name hit Ethan like a jolt. Joseph Rowan, his grandfather, the man his father had never spoken of, the man he believed had died long before he was born. His jaw tightened. "My grandfather's dead." Mason adjusted his glasses, his expression neutral. "Yes, but not when he wrote this." From the inside of his coat, he drew a thick envelope sealed with an embossed crest and offered it with deliberate care. "I was instructed to deliver this into your hands personally. Not to your father, not to anyone else. You." Ethan didn't take it immediately. His hazel eyes narrowed, suspicious. "Why now?" The attorney allowed himself the faintest sigh. Perhaps he didn't know how to say sorry in life. People find strange ways to reckon with regret. Mason glanced toward the twins, then back to Ethan. "It isn't just a letter. There's a deed inside. Property, Pine Hollow, Ashwood Valley. Neglected but intact. Legally yours." For a moment, Ethan said nothing. The twins stood pressed against him, their eyes wide, Rook leaning against Ethan's leg with a low, questioning whine. Snow swirled briefly between them, dusting the envelope like ash. Finally, Ethan reached forward and took it, the weight of thick paper heavier than expected. Mason straightened his coat. "I've fulfilled my duty. What you choose to do with it is yours alone. Good day, Sergeant." Without waiting for reply, he returned to the sedan, the black vehicle purring softly as it pulled away into the cold streets. Clara tugged at his sleeve. "Daddy, what is it?" He looked down at her, then at Rose, who clung silently to Rook's fur. "It's a letter," he said at last, "from someone we thought was gone." That evening, parked in the shadow of a church where the lights didn't reach, Ethan finally opened the envelope. The seal cracked under his rough fingers, and he unfolded the heavy paper with care. The handwriting was bold, sweeping, the strokes deliberate but marked by age. "Ethan, if you are reading this, then I am gone. I will not ask forgiveness. I lost the right to that when I turned my back on my own son. And by doing so, I lost the right to be called father or grandfather. But before leaving this world, I wish to leave something behind, not just property, but the chance to mend what I broke. The cabin in Pine Hollow was meant for your father. I was too proud. Perhaps you won't be. If you choose to take it, may it bring shelter to you and yours. Be better than I was. You already are. Joseph Rowan. The words blurred for a moment as Ethan read them twice, then a third time, his breath clouding in the frosty air. He had no memory of this man, no stories, no photographs, nothing but silence. And yet, here was a letter, carrying weight not just of property, but of legacy. He rubbed his eyes, looked back at the girls. Clara had fallen asleep with her notebook on her lap, her small hand resting on Rose's arm. Rose leaned against Rook, her cheek buried in the dog's thick fur, her lips parted in soft breaths. Ethan folded the letter carefully and slid it back into the envelope. His chest tightened. For weeks he had lived with no plan beyond tomorrow. Now a door, an unexpected one, stood cracked open. He didn't decide immediately. Instead, he drove the next morning to the library, as he often did, to warm the girls while he gathered his thoughts. Mrs. Halloway greeted them with her usual gentle bustle, her pastel cardigan buttoned wrong at the top, her glasses perched at the tip of her nose. She leaned toward Ethan as she handed Clara a stack of paper. "You look like you've been given a ghost," she said quietly. Ethan gave only the faintest nod, unwilling to share more. At a table in the far corner, a young volunteer named Sarah Collins was stacking donated books. Sarah was 23, tall and slender, with long dark hair she often tied into a braid. She wore second-hand sweaters and jeans, her hands often ink-stained from the notebooks she carried. She had grown up in Ashwood's foster system, shuffled from home to home, and carried the quiet resilience of someone who had learned to expect little and survive much. Sarah noticed Clara scribbling in her journal and leaned down, her smile gentle. "You're a writer?" she asked. Clara blinked, then nodded shyly. Sarah's smile widened. "So am I?" From that moment, Clara seemed to soften a little in her presence, and Ethan observed quietly, grateful for even a small reprieve. By late afternoon, Ethan had made up his mind. He guided the twins back to the SUV and turned onto the highway leading toward Pine Hollow. The girls exchanged puzzled glances, but he only said, "We're going to see something your mother never told us about, a place she might have known." The drive stretched long, winding through frozen valleys and stands of pines heavy with snow. Rook shifted in the back seat, his amber eyes fixed on the road, ears flicking occasionally, as though he too sensed the change. Clara clutched her notebook while Rose pressed her forehead to the window, watching the frosted world slip by. Hours later, as twilight bled across the sky, Ethan slowed the SUV onto a gravel road half buried in snow. Ahead, through the darkening trees, loomed the outline of a cabin, its roof sagging under ice, its porch leaning like a weary man, but still standing, still waiting. Ethan parked, killed the engine, and exhaled, his breath fogging the glass. "This is it," he murmured, more to himself than the girls. Rose's voice broke the silence, quiet but steady. "It smells like trees and secrets," she whispered, pressing closer to Rook. Clara nodded, eyes wide, her hand tightening around her father's. Ethan stepped out into the brittle silence, boots sinking into snow, and opened the door for his daughters. The wind cut sharp across his face, but for the first time in months, a sliver of hope, fragile but real, stirred in his chest. The cabin stood hunched at the edge of the clearing, its timbers darkened by decades of storms, its roof bowed under the weight of snow, and its porch sagging like an old man leaning on his cane. The forest surrounded it with a silence broken only by the creak of branches in the wind. Ethan stood for a long moment at the base of the porch steps, the girls pressed close to him, and Rook shifting warily at his side, ears twitching as though he recognized something older than memory. Clara clutched her notebook against her chest, gray eyes darting from window to window, as though expecting faces to stare back. Rose gripped Rook's thick fur, her lips parted, breath fogging quickly in the cold air. Ethan took a steadying breath, placed a hand on each of his daughter's shoulders, and stepped forward. The porch groaned under his boots, dusting snow from the beams. The front door, swollen with moisture, resisted at first, then yielded with a creak that echoed through the hollow rooms. A stale draft poured out, dust, pine resin, and the faint metallic tang of age. Ethan lifted his phone and switched on the flashlight, the beam trembling across cobwebs and cracked picture frames. The floor was blanketed in dust so thick that each step left a dark print behind. The cabin was small but sturdy. A living room, with a stone fireplace stained black from old fires. A kitchen with iron fixtures dulled by rust. 2 narrow bedrooms, and an attic door hanging crookedly from its hinges. Furniture lay draped in white sheets, the shapes of chairs and tables looming like ghosts at rest. Clara whispered, "It's like a haunted house." Rose, still holding Rook's collar, muttered, "A tired one." Ethan managed a faint smile. "Then we'll make it tired and warm instead." They set down their bags in the living room. Ethan stacked kindling left near the porch, coaxing flame into the old iron stove. Smoke began to thread upward, the orange glow spilling into the gloom, chasing shadows into corners. The girls unrolled their blankets, arranging their meager belongings on the floor as though nesting birds. Rook circled once before dropping beside them, his amber eyes steady on Ethan, as if asking silently whether they would stay. As the stove warmed, Clara wandered toward a bookshelf sagging with age. She brushed away dust to reveal a photo album. Sitting beside her father, she flipped through yellowed pages of black and white photographs, men in uniform standing beside tents, hunting trips with dogs, families in front of Christmas trees. One photograph caught Clara's breath. A girl about 6 years old stood on this very porch, her hair in braids, her smile crooked with a missing tooth. Around her neck hung a small star-shaped necklace. Clara looked up, eyes wide. "Daddy, that's Mommy." Ethan took the photo, his hands trembling. In the corner, faint pencil read, "Summer 1991. Joseph, Doreen, Ela." He stared for a long time, stunned that Ela had once been here, that she had walked these floors, laughed under this roof, in a place she had never spoken of. Rose leaned close, her small hand brushing the faded image, as though reaching for the mother she could barely remember. Later, after the girls had fallen asleep, wrapped in quilts found in a chest upstairs, Ethan prowled the house with his flashlight. The beam slid across the kitchen, where a heavy wooden toolbox rested beneath the counter. Something about its position seemed odd. He dragged it aside, revealing faint seams in the floor. His pulse quickened. Dropping to his knees, he pried at the boards until one lifted with a groan. Beneath lay a crawl space. Inside sat a metal box, rusted and heavy, with a dial lock on the front. The top bore a single word etched deep, "Rowan." Ethan heaved it onto the counter, dust rising like smoke. His fingers turned the dial, first to his birthday, then to his badge number. Nothing. Finally, without thinking, he tried Ila's date of death. The lock clicked. His breath caught. Slowly, he lifted the lid. Inside was a bundle of letters tied with red string. A faded photograph of 2 men and a German shepherd, unmistakably younger, but with Rook's same amber gaze, sitting proudly beside a stern man in uniform. Next to it lay a wooden box containing a silver star medal. A note, fragile and yellowing, rested atop the pile. "You weren't told. I tried. I failed." Ethan stared, his throat dry, unable to reconcile the weight of the words with the silence of his family's history. Rook padded forward, pressing his head against Ethan's thigh, eyes solemn, tail tapping once. "You knew," Ethan whispered, his hand trembling against the dog's fur. "You brought us here." The letters were heavy, thick with ink and time, their paper crinkled but preserved. Ethan resisted opening them all at once, knowing they contained truths long buried. Instead, he sat at the table, staring at the photograph, the medal, the box of secrets now laid bare. For the first time in months, he didn't feel like he was fleeing. He felt rooted, confused, grieving still, but planted firmly in something bigger than his own pain. As dawn approached, the girls stirred upstairs, their soft voices drifting through the beams. Rose giggled faintly as Clara urged her to wake, their footsteps padding against the wood. Ethan tucked the items back into the metal box, sealing it for the moment, but not from fear, rather to give himself time to process. He straightened just as Clara appeared on the stairs, hair wild, notebook clutched in her hand. "Daddy," she whispered, "is this our house now?" Ethan looked at her, at Rose standing shyly beside her, at Rook watching with patient eyes. He inhaled slowly, the weight of the past pressing against his ribs, then exhaled with something like resolve. "Yes," he said softly. "This is our house." The cabin, once cloaked in dust and secrets, seemed to breathe with them, as if welcoming back the family it had always been meant to hold. The morning after Ethan had declared the cabin their home, the air outside smelled of pine and thawing earth. Patches of snow still clung to the ground, but the light had softened, carrying the first suggestion of spring. Ethan stepped onto the sagging porch, his breath white in the air, and surveyed the place that had been thrust upon him by a man he had never known. The roof sagged dangerously, the porch railing leaned, and the windows bore spiderweb cracks. Yet, for the first time since Ila's death, he did not see ruin. He saw the bones of something that could hold not just his family, but perhaps others who were lost. Inside, Clara and Rose ate oatmeal he had coaxed out of a battered tin in the cupboard, their cheeks flushed from sleep, their hair wild from quilts that smelled faintly of cedar. Rook lay at their feet, tail sweeping the floorboards lazily, his amber eyes scanning each corner of the room as if memorizing it. Ethan crouched beside the stove, poking at the embers until they flared. His chest tightened, not with grief, but with an unfamiliar sense of possibility. That afternoon, a truck rattled up the gravel road. Ethan stepped outside warily, one hand brushing the badge in his pocket out of instinct. The driver was a man in his late 50s, heavy-set, his face weathered like leather. He wore a plaid flannel shirt stretched over a broad chest, suspenders clipped to worn jeans, and a knitted cap pulled low over graying hair. When he climbed down, Ethan noticed the limp in his gait, the kind born of old injury. "Name's Lou Carter," the man said, his voice gravelly but warm. "I used to keep an eye on this place back when your grandfather was too old to do it himself. Saw the smoke last night. Figured someone finally moved in." Lou Carter had been a carpenter most of his life, until an accident with a table saw cost him 2 fingers and forced him into early retirement. His body bore the marks of labor, broad hands scarred and stiff, shoulders still thick with old strength. But his eyes were kind, a faded green that softened when he spoke. Though life had hardened his body, it had tempered his spirit into quiet generosity. Ethan nodded slowly. "I'm Ethan Rowan. My girls and we're staying here now." Lou squinted at him, then at the twins peeking through the window, Clara's notebook visible in her hands. A smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. "Place needs work, but it's got good bones. If you want, I can lend you some tools, maybe even a few hands." Ethan hesitated. Pride stiffened his shoulders, but he exhaled. "I'd appreciate that." Over the following days, Lou became a steady presence. He arrived each morning with his old pickup rattling, tools rattling in the bed, and thermoses of black coffee. He showed Ethan how to shore up the porch beams, replace rotted boards, and patch the leaking roof. Clara often sat on the steps sketching the process, her pencil scratching, furiously as though recording each nail driven. Rose, quieter, trailed Lou like a shadow, carrying small tools in her mittened hands, her brown eyes wide with curiosity. Lou spoke gently to her, calling her "little helper," and for the first time in weeks, she responded with shy smiles. As the cabin transformed, so too did Ethan's vision. Each plank nailed, each window repaired, stirred something deeper. This wasn't just a place to live. It could be a place for others who had nowhere else to go. Memories of the families he had escorted out of violence during his years on the force, the veterans he had once pulled back from the edge after trauma, the broken people he had met on city streets. They all pressed into his thoughts. The cabin could be more than refuge. It could be a sanctuary. One evening, as shadows stretched across the valley, Ethan shared his idea with Lou. They sat on the porch steps, mugs of coffee steaming between their palms. "I keep thinking," Ethan said slowly, "maybe this house isn't just for us. Maybe it can be a place for people who don't fit anywhere else. People who've been through too much to go back, but aren't ready to give up." Lou studied him for a moment, his weathered face unreadable, then nodded. A place like that saved me once. After the accident, I didn't think I had a use anymore. If someone hadn't told me I still mattered, I don't know where I'd be. You want to do that here? I'll help. Ethan felt the words settle like anchors in his chest. I think it's what this place was meant for. The next week, others began to come. Word spread quietly through town that the Rowan cabin was open to those who needed a hand. The first was a young mother named Marlene Torres. She was 30, small in stature, with a sturdy frame, her dark hair cut blunt at her shoulders, her brown eyes sharp with vigilance. Marlene had escaped a violent partner in Wyoming with her 3 children, and though her voice carried steel, her hands shook when she spoke. Ethan welcomed her in, offering quilts and space by the fire. Clara and Rose, once tentative, soon drew the children into their games, the cabin ringing with laughter for the first time in months. Soon after came Eli Turner, a veteran like Ethan but older, in his mid-40s, thin and gaunt with eyes too large for his face. His sandy hair was patchy, his skin pale, and his body carried the tremor of years battling addiction. Eli had once served as a medic in Afghanistan, saving lives even as he lost pieces of himself. He spoke rarely, but when he did, his voice was soft, thoughtful, filled with knowledge gleaned in dust and blood. Rook took to him immediately, often curling at his feet, as though sensing wounds unseen. Together, the mismatched group began shaping the cabin into something more. The garage was cleared and converted into a common room. Bunks were built from old timber, quilts stitched together from donated, fabric everyone contributed. Marlene cooked meals, Lou hammered beams, Eli fixed broken pipes with careful hands, and Ethan oversaw it all with quiet determination. Clara organized a small garden plot with Rose trailing behind her, planting seeds in rows like promises to the earth. One night, after the children had gone to sleep and the adults sat by the fire, Ethan hung a small plaque above the mantel. It was simple wood, carved by Lou and stained by Clara's careful hands. The words burned into it read, "Healing is loyalty." Ethan stared at the phrase for a long moment before speaking. "Rook taught me that," he said quietly. "He's never left us. Through every night in that car, through every cold morning, he stayed. Maybe that's what healing is, staying long enough for the broken pieces to fit again." The fire crackled, throwing warm light across their faces. Marlene nodded, her eyes wet. Eli reached down, brushing Rook's fur with a trembling hand. Lou sipped his coffee, gaze steady on Ethan. And for the first time since Illa's death, Ethan felt not only less alone, but part of something larger than grief, larger than survival. The cabin had become more than a house. It was becoming a sanctuary, a mission that bound them together. By late spring, the cabin had shifted from ruin to rhythm. The garden Clara had planted sprouted neat rows of green, the smell of fresh soil mixing with wood smoke. Rose had grown bolder, often seen chasing the Whitmore children, Marlene's brood, around the yard, while Rook played watchman, his black and silver coat flashing in the sun. Inside, Eli kept careful watch over the plumbing and wiring, hands steadier now than when he'd first arrived, while Marlene's cooking filled the kitchen with aromas that made the place feel like a home rather than a shelter. Lou Carter came by most mornings, leaning on his limp but always smiling, his laugh echoing across the clearing. Word had spread beyond Ashwood. Neighbors brought quilts, canned food, old tools. A retired teacher from town began offering lessons to the children twice a week in the converted garage, chalk squeaking against a salvaged blackboard while the kids scribbled furiously in donated notebooks. Ethan stood on the porch often, watching this unlikely community unfold, his chest filling with something equal parts pride and disbelief. It was during one of these afternoons, when the yard buzzed with the sound of children's laughter and the garden tools clanked against the soil, that a truck pulled into the gravel drive. It wasn't Lou's familiar pickup, nor one of the neighbors' cars. This one was battered, its green paint faded, the muffler rattling with each turn. The door opened, and a man stepped out slowly, almost uncertainly. He was in his late 30s, tall but gaunt, his frame bent slightly as though carrying invisible weight. His dark brown hair was longer than regulation, unkempt, streaked prematurely with gray. A rough beard shadowed his jaw, and his clothes, faded jeans and a denim jacket, spoke of long nights without a roof. His eyes, though, were unmistakable, steel blue, sharp but haunted. Eyes that had once belonged to a soldier, Ethan knew. "Carson?" Ethan's voice cracked with disbelief. The man looked up, blinking against the sun, then gave a slow nod. "Didn't know if you'd remember me." Ethan descended the porch steps, Rook already bounding forward, barking once before stopping short, tail wagging low, as if recognizing an old comrade. Clara and Rose froze near the garden, their notebooks and toys forgotten as they stared. Carson Hale had once served with Ethan overseas. In Iraq, he had been the steady one, broad-shouldered, quick to laugh, the man who pulled Ethan out of a burning Humvee 12 years ago, taking shrapnel to the leg in the process. But war had not been kind after that. Addiction, failed marriages, and years of drifting had hollowed him into a shadow of the man Ethan remembered. His gait was uneven now, not just from the injury but from weariness, and his voice when he spoke again carried gravel, broken by nights shouting into silence. "I heard about this place," Carson said, eyes sweeping the cabin, the children, the garden. "Didn't know it was yours until I saw your name." Ethan clasped his old friend's shoulder, gripping hard. "You saved my life once. You'll always have a place here." Carson's eyes shimmered briefly before he dropped his gaze, nodding. The others welcomed him cautiously but kindly. Marlene handed him a plate of stew without question. Eli offered a seat near the fire, where Carson sat quietly, eyes darting to every corner as though expecting judgment. The children were curious but kept their distance until Rook, tail wagging, nudged Carson's leg with his nose. That small gesture broke the wall. Rose wandered over first, pressing a drawing into Carson's hand. It was crude, a stick figure standing beside a big dog under a crooked sun. Carson stared at it, then gave a rough chuckle that sounded more like a sob. "Guess that's me, huh?" Rose only nodded and leaned against his knee. That night, when the cabin had settled into quiet, Ethan and Carson sat on the porch with mugs of coffee, the fireflies blinking in the field beyond. Carson stared into the dark. "After the Humvee, after I got back, it all came apart. Couldn't keep a job, couldn't keep a wife. I kept hearing the fire, kept feeling the heat, like it never left. I thought about ending it more times than I'll admit. But then someone in Missoula told me about a house out here where broken folks were building something new. Said maybe it was worth one last drive." Ethan listened without interruption, his own chest tightening with recognition. He placed a hand firmly on Carson's shoulder. "You found it. You're not alone anymore." Carson stayed. He converted the old shed into a wood shop, his broad hands rediscovering old skills as he taught Clara and Rose how to carve simple shapes from scrap pine. The kids from Marlene's family joined in, their laughter ringing as Carson showed them how to sand edges smooth, his rough voice softening as he explained each step. Slowly, the haunted look in his eyes dimmed, replaced by sparks of purpose. But Carson wasn't the only ghost to knock. Weeks later, during a clear evening when the cabin was alive with chatter, another visitor came. A woman in her mid-30s walked up the drive, her steps quick, her figure tall and willowy under a trench coat. Her hair was auburn, tied back, and her face carried sharp lines softened by exhaustion. She introduced herself as Detective Sarah Whitfield, a social worker turned investigator who had grown up in foster care herself. Life had made her sharp-eyed and pragmatic, but also fiercely protective of children who had been left behind by broken systems. "I heard about the Rowan cabin," she explained at the door, her voice steady but edged with weariness. "Word is, you're keeping kids safe here. I need to see that with my own eyes." Ethan studied her, noting the firmness of her stance, the way her hazel eyes scanned the room with precision, cataloging details. She was not here to smile, she was here to judge. But when she saw Clara handing a book to Rose, when she noticed Marlene stirring soup while Eli repaired a chair, when she spotted Carson guiding the children's small hands across blocks of wood, her expression shifted. She exhaled slowly. "You've built something real here, something rare." Ethan nodded. "We're just trying to give people a chance." Sarah gave him a long look, then the faintest of smiles. "Keep doing what you're doing. You'll be seeing more of me. I don't like to leave good work unsupported." That night, after she left, the fire in the cabin seemed warmer. Carson's laughter joined Marlene's gentle scolding of her children. Eli told a rare story of saving lives under desert sun. Clara sketched by lantern glow, Rose curled against Rook's flank, and Ethan sat at the center of it all, his chest swelling with something he hadn't felt in years, hope steady enough to hold. By summer, the cabin no longer looked like the weary husk it had once been. The porch stood straight, its railings sanded and painted. The roof gleamed with new shingles that caught the morning sun. The garden stretched wider, rows of beans, corn, and tomatoes tilting toward the sky. Children's laughter filled the clearing daily, mingling with the steady thump of hammers or the scrape of saws. The Rowan cabin had become a place known throughout Ashwood not as a ruin, but as the mission house, a sanctuary born from grief and rebuilt in loyalty. Ethan often woke before dawn, his body still trained by years of patrol, and stood at the window watching the first light brush across the valley. His daughters, Clara and Rose, had blossomed here. Clara spent hours in her notebook, sketching and writing, her storm-gray eyes bright with curiosity that no longer carried only sorrow. Rose, once silent, now trailed after the older children, her brown eyes alight with mischief, as she helped water the garden or chase chickens they had bartered from a neighbor. Rook never strayed far, his 6-year-old frame still strong, his black and silver fur gleaming as he patrolled the perimeter, ears flicking at every bird call, his amber eyes steady as though measuring each soul who came and went. The mission house had drawn more than just wanderers. One day in June, a retired teacher named Helen Myers began visiting weekly. Helen was in her late 60s, short and stout, with a cloud of white hair pinned in a bun and spectacles that dangled from a chain around her neck. She had spent her life teaching English literature, and though arthritis bent her fingers now, her voice still carried warmth and authority. She took the children under her wing, teaching them stories and poems, insisting that even broken beginnings deserve beautiful words. A story, she often told them, is proof that you've survived long enough to tell it. Clara adored her, often sitting closest, scribbling lines in her notebook as Helen read aloud. Eli, the medic, found new strength in routine. He had once trembled at night, his body racked by old cravings, but here he grew steadier, teaching teenagers basic first aid, showing them how to bandage cuts, test water, and calm frightened friends. Marlene, with her 3 children, had found courage too. Her laughter returned, soft and musical, when she watched her children run safely across the field without fear of fists raised in anger. Lou Carter remained steadfast, teaching the men and boys carpentry, his heavy frame bent over planks, his missing fingers never slowing his skill. And Carson, Ethan's old comrade, was perhaps the most transformed. His haunted blue eyes had softened. He still carried shadows, but the woodshop gave him purpose. He carved frames for the children's drawings, built chairs for the common room, and taught the girls how to shape wood into animals. He laughed more freely now, though sometimes the laughter cracked into silence, and Ethan would sit with him quietly, no words needed. Detective Sarah Whitfield returned often. Tall, auburn-haired, with her willowy figure clad in plain suits, she carried her weariness with dignity. Her sharp hazel eyes softened when she saw the children thriving. Sarah had grown up shuffled between foster homes, never knowing permanence, and perhaps that was why she came back. She told Ethan once, in a rare moment of openness, "I spent my childhood waiting for a knock that never came, the knock of someone choosing to stay. What you've built here is what I once prayed for." That confession lingered with Ethan, feeding his resolve. As the weeks passed, the mission house became more than sanctuary. It became a beacon. Neighbors donated lumber, blankets, even livestock. Veterans seeking quiet arrived, mothers with children came, and each time, Ethan found space for them. The cabin's walls seemed to expand with every new soul who entered. One evening, as the sun sank golden across the valley, they held their first true gathering. Long tables were dragged into the yard, covered with mismatched tablecloths. Lanterns and string lights, hung by Clara and Rose, glowed as dusk deepened. The meal was simple: vegetables from the garden, bread Marlene had baked, stew simmered by Eli, but it felt abundant. Voices rose in laughter, children darted between tables, and the mission house seemed to hum with life. Helen Myers stood to give a toast, her small frame steady, her voice rich. We are not defined by what we've lost, but by what we've chosen to build with what remains. Tonight proves that light can be carved from the deepest shadow. Her words drew quiet nods and then applause. Carson rose next, clearing his throat, his voice rough. I thought my life was finished years ago. But Ethan didn't turn me away. None of you did. And now I get to carve more than wood. I get to carve out a place where I belong again. His hand trembled as he set down his glass, but his smile was real. Even Sarah spoke, though briefly. My work takes me to places where hope is rare, but here I've found proof that it can be planted and grown. As the night deepened, Clara stood nervously and unfolded a sheet from her notebook. Her voice trembled, but she read, "We didn't find just a house. We found a home made of people who stayed." Tears shone in many eyes. Later, as lanterns swayed gently in the breeze and fireflies winked in the field, Ethan sat on the porch steps. Clara leaned against him on one side, Rose curled on the other, fast asleep. Rook rested his heavy head on Ethan's knee, tail thumping once. Around them, the mission house buzzed with soft chatter, the sound of dishes clinking, and the quiet hum of a world beginning to heal. Ethan gazed at the faces lit by warm light. Lou, with his broad smile, Marlene's children giggling in the grass, Eli telling stories to the teenagers, Helen guiding Clara's pen over a new poem, Carson laughing with Sarah, his chest filled with a peace he had thought he'd never feel again. Illa's absence would always ache, but he could almost hear her laughter carried on the night air, as though she too sat among them. The mission house was no longer just his inheritance. It was a legacy, a place where grief became hope, where strangers became family, where broken souls found the courage to stand again. And as the stars spilled across the sky above Ashwood Valley, Ethan Rowan knew with certainty they had come home. This story reminds us that even in the darkest valleys, God's hand can guide us toward the light. What looked like loss and ruin became a miracle of second chances, a home where broken hearts were made whole again. In our daily lives, too, we can trust that God is working quietly, turning pain into purpose and sorrow into hope. If this story touched you, please share it with someone who needs encouragement. Leave a comment to let us know your thoughts, and subscribe so you never miss another journey of faith and resilience. May God bless you and your family today and always. And if you believe in the quiet miracles He still performs, write Amen in the comments.